I'm doing this here too. So over on my YouTube, I'm going to be taking this in chunks. So I just want to share with all of you here where we are in the beginning. So I understand that understanding what social realism is can be difficult. But I'm going to take a cue from Vaclav Havel here and explain it this way. Now, as we know, there are 4 pillars to social realism: idealist, cartoonist, classicalist, ardenist. Right? Power of the Powerless by Vaclav Havel. I'm going to be reading from section very beginning through to the end of the section on ideology. So we're going to cover the idealist pillar now. Okay? And remember, he was a playwright and later became the first president of Czechoslovakia after the fall of the Soviet Union, and is considered one of the people responsible, if not the leader, of what they call the Velvet Revolution and what helped lead to the fall of the Soviet Union. A specter is haunting Eastern Europe. By the way, this was published in 1979, 2 years after Charter 77. May of 1979. A specter is haunting Eastern Europe. The specter of what in the West is called dissent. This specter has not appeared out of thin air. It is a natural and inevitable consequence of the present historical phase of the system it is haunting. It was born at a time when this system, for thousands of reasons, can no longer base itself on the unadulterated, brutal, and arbitrary application of power, eliminating all expressions of nonconformity. What is more, the system has become so ossified politically that there is practically no way for such nonconformity to be implemented within its official structures. Who are these so-called dissidents? Where does their point of view come from? And of what importance does it have? What is the significance of the independent initiatives in which dissidents collaborate? And what real chances do such initiatives have of success? Is it appropriate to refer to dissidents as an opposition? If so, what exactly is such an opposition within the framework of the system? What does it do? What role does it play in society? What are its hopes? And on what are they based? Is it within the power of the dissidents as a category of sub-citizen outside the power establishment to have any influence at all on society and the social system? Can they actually change anything? I think that an examination of these questions and an examination of the potential of the powerless can only begin with an examination of the nature of power in the circumstances in which these powerless people operate. Our system, section 2, our system is most frequently categorized as a dictatorship, or more precisely, as the dictatorship of a political bureaucracy over a society which has undergone economic and social leveling. I am afraid that the term dictatorship, regardless of how intelligible it may otherwise be, tends to obscure, rather than clarify, the real nature of power in this system. We usually associate the term with a notion of a small group of people who take over the government of a given country by force. Their power is wielded openly, using the direct instruments of power at their disposal. They are easily distinguished socially from the majority over whom they rule. One of the essential aspects of this traditional or classical notion of dictatorship is the assumption that it is temporary, ephemeral, lacking historical roots. Its existence seems to be bound up with the lives of who established it. It is usually local in extent and significance, and regardless of the ideology it utilizes to grant itself legitimacy, its power derives ultimately from the numbers and the armed might of its soldiers and police. The principal threat to its existence is felt to be the possibility that someone better equipped in this sense might appear and overthrow it. Even this very superficial overview should make it clear that the system in which we live has very little in common with the classical dictatorship. In the first place, our system is not limited in a local geographical sense. Rather, it holds sway over a huge power block controlled by one of the two superpowers. And although it is quite naturally exhibiting a number of local and historical variations, the range of these variations is fundamentally circumscribed by a single unifying framework throughout the power block. Not only is the dictatorship everywhere based on the same principles and structured in the same way, that is, in the way evolved by the ruling superpower, but each country has been completely penetrated by a network of manipulatory instruments controlled by the superpower center and totally subordinated to its interests. In the stalemated world of nuclear parity, of course, that circumstance endows the system with an unprecedented degree of external stability, compared with classical dictatorships. Many local crises which, in an isolated state, would lead to a change in the system, can be resolved through direct intervention by the armed forces of the rest of the bloc. In the second place, if a feature of classical dictatorships is that it lacks historical roots, frequently they appear to be no more than historical freaks, the fortuitous consequence of fortuitous social processes or of human and mob tendencies. The same cannot be said so facilely about our system. For even though our dictatorship has long since alienated itself completely from the social movements that gave birth to it, the authenticity of these movements, and I am thinking of the proletarian and socialist movements of the 19th century, give it undeniable historicity. These origins provided a solid foundation of sorts on which it could build until it became utterly the new social and political reality that it is today, which has become so inextricably a part of the structure of the modern world. A feature of those historical origins was the correct understanding of social conflicts of the period from which those original movements emerged. The fact that at the very core of this correct understanding, there was a genetic disposition toward the monstrous, alienating characteristic of its subsequence and its development, and this is essential here. And in any case, this element also grew organically from the climate of that time, and therefore can be said to have its origin there as well. Side note, Socialism was defined at the time of Stalin in the Union of Soviet Writers as being the historically concrete, truthful, and correct interpretation of reality in its evolutionary development in order to engineer human souls and minds toward revolution and socialism, and then communism and enslavement. I'm adding the latter there, but that was for anyone who understood what the vanguard was up to. That's what it meant. Historically concrete and correct. Our legacy, one legacy of that original correct understanding, is a third peculiarity that makes our systems different from other modern dictatorships. It commands an incomparably more precise, logically structured, generally comprehensible, and in essence extremely flexible ideology that in its elaborateness and completeness is almost a secularized religion. It offers a ready answer to any question whatsoever. It can scarcely be accepted only in part, and accepting it has profound implications for human life. In an era when metaphysical and existential certainties are in a state of crisis, when people are being uprooted and alienated and are losing their sense of what this world means, this ideology, inevitably, has a certain hypnotic charm. To wandering humankind, it offers an immediately available home. All one has to do is accept it. And suddenly, everything becomes clear. Once more, and life takes on new meaning. All mysteries, unanswered questions, anxieties, and loneliness vanish. course, one pays dearly for this low-rent home. The price is abdication of one's own reason, conscience, and responsibility. For an essential aspect of this ideology is the consignment of reason and conscience to a higher authority. The principle involved here is that the center of power is identical with the center of truth. In our case, the connection with the Byzantine theocracy is direct. The highest secular authority is identical with the highest spiritual authority. It is true, of course, that, all this aside, ideology is the consignment of reason. All this aside, ideology no longer has any great influence on people. At least within our bloc, within the possible exception of Russia, where the serf mentality with its blind, fatalistic respect for rulers and its automatic acceptance of all their claims is still dominant, and combined with a superpower patriotism which traditionally places the interests of empire higher than the interests of humanity. But this is not important, because ideology plays its role in our system very well, an issue which I will return precisely because it is what it is. He continues. Fourth, the technique. Excuse me, I have to get a little more comfortable here. Thank you. Fourth, the technique of exercising power in traditional dictatorships contains a necessary element of improvisation. The mechanisms for wielding power are, for the most part, not established firmly. And there is considerable room for accident and for the arbitrary and unregulated application of power. Socially, psychologically, and physically, conditions still exist for the expression of some form of opposition. In short, there are many seams on the surface which can split apart before the entire power structure has managed to stabilize. Our system, on the other hand, has been developing in the Soviet Union for over 60 years, and for approximately 30 years in Eastern Europe. Moreover, several of its long-established structural features are derived from czarist absolutism. In terms of the physical aspects of power, this has led to the creation of such intricate and well-developed mechanisms for the direct and indirect manipulation of the entire population that, as a physical power base, it represents something radically new. At the same time, let us not forget that the system is made significantly more effective by state ownership and central direction of all means of production. This gives the power structure an unprecedented and uncontrollable capacity to invest in itself. In the areas of bureaucracy and the police, for example, and makes it easier for that structure, as the sole employer, to manipulate the day-to-day existence of all citizens. Finally, if an atmosphere of revolutionary excitement, heroism, dedication, and boisterous violence on all sides characterizes classical dictatorships, then the last traces of such an atmosphere have vanished from the Soviet bloc. For some time now, this bloc has ceased to be a kind of enclave, isolated from the rest of the developed world and immune to the processes occurring in it. To the contrary, the Soviet bloc is an integral part of the larger world, and it shares and shapes the world's destiny. This means, in concrete terms, that the hierarchy of values existing in the developed countries of the West has, in essence, appeared in our society. The long period of coexistence with the West has only hastened this process. In other words, what we have here is simply another form of the consumer and industrial society, with all its concomitant social, intellectual, and psychological consequences. It is impossible to understand the nature of power in our system properly without taking this into account. This is a quick side note. The profound difference between our system in terms of the nature of power and what we traditionally understand by dictatorship, a difference I hope is clear even with this quite superficial comparison has caused me to search for some term appropriate for our system, purely for the purposes of this essay. If I refer to it henceforth as a post-totalitarian system, I'm fully aware that this is perhaps not the most precise term, but I am not even able to think of a better one. I do not wish to imply by the prefix poso that the system is no longer totalitarian. On the contrary, I mean that it is totalitarian in a way fundamentally different from classical dictatorships, different from totalitarianism as we understand it. The circumstances I mentioned, however, form only a circle of conditional factors and a kind of phenomenal framework for the actual composition of power in the post-totalitarian system, several aspects of which I shall now attempt to identify. Section 3. The manager of a fruit and vegetable shop places in his window, among the onions and the carrots, the slogan, "Workers of the world, unite." Why does he do it? What is he trying to communicate to the world? Is he genuinely enthusiastic about the idea of unity among the workers of the world? Is his enthusiasm so great that he feels an irrepressible impulse to acquaint the public with his ideals? Has he really given more than a moment's thought to how such a unification might occur and what it would mean? I think it can safely be assumed that the overwhelming majority of shopkeepers never think about the slogans they put in their windows, nor do they use them to express their real opinions. That poster was delivered to our greengrocer from the enterprise headquarters along with the onions and the carrots. He put them all into the window simply because it has been done that way for years, because everyone does it, and because that is the way it has to be. If he were to refuse, there could be trouble. He could be reproached for not having the proper decoration in his window. Someone might even accuse him of disloyalty. He does it because these things must be done if one is to get along in life. If one is to get along in life, it is one of the thousands of details that guarantees him a relatively tranquil life in harmony with society, as they say. Obviously, the greengrocer is indifferent to the semantic content of the slogan on exhibit. He did not put the slogan in his window from any personal desire to acquaint the public with the ideal it expresses. This, of course, does not mean that his action has no motive or significance at all, or that the slogan communicates nothing to anyone. The slogan is really a sign, and as such it contains a subliminal but very definitive message. Verbally, it might be expressed this way: I, the greengrocer, XY, live here, and I know what I must do. I behave in a manner expected of me. I can be depended upon, and I am beyond reproach. I am obedient, and therefore I have the right to be left in peace. This message, of course, has an addressee. It is directed above to the greengrocer's superior, and at the same time, it is a shield that protects the greengrocer from potential informers. The slogan's real meaning, therefore, is rooted firmly in the greengrocer's existence. It reflects his vital interests. But what are those vital interests? Let us take note. If the greengrocer had been instructed to display the slogan, "I am afraid and therefore unquestioningly obedient," he would not nearly be as indifferent to the semantics, even though the statement would reflect the truth. The greengrocer would be embarrassed and ashamed to put such an unequivocal statement of his own degradation in the shop window, and quite naturally so, for he is a human being, and thus has a sense of his own dignity. To overcome this complication, his expression of loyalty must take a form of a sign which, at least on the textual surface, indicates a level of disinterested conviction. It must allow the greengrocer to say, what's wrong with the workers of the world uniting? Thus, the sign helps the greengrocer to conceal from himself the low foundations of his obedience. At the same time, concealing the low foundations of power. It hides them behind the facade of something high, and that something is ideology. Ideology is a specious way of relating to the world. It offers human beings the illusion of identity, of dignity, and of morality, while making it easier for them to part with them. As the repository of something supra-personal and objective, it enables people to conceive their conscience and conceal their true position and their inglorious modus vivendi, both from the world and from themselves. It is a very pragmatic, but at the same time an apparently dignified way of legitimizing what is above, below, and on either side. It is directed toward people and toward God. It is a veil behind which human beings can hide their own fallen existence, their trivialization, and their adaptation to the status quo. It is an excuse that everyone can use. From the greengrocer who conceals his fear of losing his job behind an alleged interest in the unification of the workers of the world, to the highest functionary, whose interest in staying in power can be cloaked in phrases about service to the working class. The primary excusatory function of ideology, therefore, is to provide people, both as victims and pillars of the post-totalitarian system, with the illusion that the system is in harmony with the human order and the order of the universe. The smaller the dictatorship and the less stratified by modernization of society under it, the more directly the will of the dictator can be exercised. In other words, the dictator can employ more or less naked discipline, avoiding the complex process of relating to the world and of self-justification, which ideology involves. But the more complex the mechanisms of power become, the larger and more stratified the society they embrace, and the longer they have operated historically, the more individuals must be connected to them from outside, and the greater the importance attached to the ideological excuse. It acts as a kind of bridge between the regime and the people, across which the regime approaches the people, and the people approach the regime. This explains why ideology plays such an important role in the post-totalitarian system. That complex machinery of units, hierarchies, transmission belts, and indirect instruments of manipulation which ensure in countless ways the integrity of the regime, leaving nothing to chance, would be quite simply unthinkable without ideology acting as its all-embracing excuse and as the excuse for each of its parts. So that was section 4. And what I think also just occurred to me, we could maybe say, sorry, I'm trying to fix my I have to bear with me a moment, my plug here is not working correctly. Sorry for, turn away for a moment while I give you all seasickness. What I'm trying to get at here, I think this thought just occurred to me, and maybe this helps clarify some stuff. I think that to say that woke is the main substance of what we're dealing with is inaccurate. Woke is one of the pillars ideologically of the post-totalitarian system, or of the socialist system. That's why it doesn't serve us to just keep focusing on the ideological contents of what we're dealing with here. And the reason it doesn't serve us is simply because it's only one of the elements, and it's socialist. So woke is socialist because it is part of, it doesn't exist without it. Let me see if I got this to work. If I did not, I will. Well, we're going to hope so. But if I lose you, I'll come back. So we're going to go, I'll go into YouTube later on and I'll finish this next section, but I'm going to keep reading. Again, remember, this man, Vaclav, was a playwright. And I sure do hope that this is working, but we're going to cross our fingers here. Or I might have to move. I'm getting nervous. But I don't want to keep you guys all waiting. So here we go. I'm going to keep going, and if we lose this, we'll go move on forward. So now we've talked about ideanost, ideological content, one of the 4 pillars of sokrealism. Remember, sokios, meaning relating, and it is not true. It's like sociopathic realism, okay? So, section 4, orientation toward the masses. This is where I'm attaching the pillars as we go along to each section. Between the aims of the post-totalitarian system and the aims of life, there is a yawning abyss. While life, in its essence, moves towards plurality, diversity, independent self-constitution, and self-organization, in short, toward the fulfillment of its own freedom, the post-totalitarian system demands conformity, uniformity, and discipline. While life ever strives to create new and improbable structures, the post-totalitarian system contrives to force life into its most probable states. The aim of the system reveals its most essential characteristic to be introversion, a movement toward being ever more completely and unreservedly itself, which means that the radius of its influence is continually widening as well. The system serves people only to the extent necessary to ensure that people will serve it. Anything beyond this, that is to say, anything which leads people to overstep their predetermined roles, is regarded by the system as an attack upon itself. And in this respect, it is correct. Every instance of such transgression is a genuine denial of the system. It can be said, therefore, that the inner aim of the post-totalitarian system is not pure preservation of power in the hands of a ruling clique, as appears to be the case at first sight, but rather the social phenomenon of self-preservation is subordinated to something higher, to a kind of blind automatism, which drives the system. No matter what position individuals hold in the hierarchy of power, they are not considered by the system to be worth anything in themselves, but only as things intended to fuel and serve this automatism. For this reason, an individual's desire for power is admissible only insofar as the direction coincides with the direction of the automatism of the system. Ideology, in creating a bridge of excuses between the system and the individual, spans the abyss between the aims of the system and the aims of life. It pretends that the requirements of the system derive from the requirements of life. It is a world of appearances, trying to pass for reality. The post-totalitarian system touches everybody at every step, but it does so with its ideological gloves on. This is why life in the system is so thoroughly permeated with hypocrisy and lies. Government by bureaucracy is called popular government. The working class is enslaved in the name of the working class. The complete degradation of the individual is presented as his ultimate liberation. Depriving people of information is called making it available. The use of power to manipulate is called the public control of power. And the arbitrary abuse of power is called observing the legal code. The repression of culture is called its development. The expansion of imperial influence is presented as a support for the oppressed. The lack of free expression becomes the highest form of freedom. Farcical elections become the highest form of democracy. Banning independent thought becomes the most scientific of worldviews. Military occupation becomes the highest form of freedom and becomes fraternal assistance. Military occupation becomes fraternal assistance. Because the regime is captive to its own lies, it must falsify everything It falsifies the past. It falsifies the future. It falsifies the present. It falsifies statistics. It pretends not to possess an omnipotent and unprincipled police apparatus. It pretends to respect human rights. It pretends to persecute no one. It pretends to fear nothing. It pretends to pretend nothing. Individuals need not believe all these mystifications, but they must behave as though they did. Or they must at least tolerate them in silence, or get along well with those who work with them. For this reason, however, they must live within a lie. They need not accept the lie. It is enough for them to have accepted their life with it and in it. By this very fact, individuals confirm the system, fulfill the system, make the system, are the system. He continues in section 5. And here we see him merging it with class consciousness, as well as with orientation toward the masses. We have seen that the real meaning of the greengrocer slogan has nothing to do with what the text of the slogan actually says. Even so, this real meaning is quite clear and quite comprehensible because the code is so familiar. The greengrocer declares his loyalty, and he can do no other if his declaration is to be accepted in the only way that the regime is capable of hearing it, that is, by accepting the prescribed ritual, by accepting appearances as reality, by accepting the given rules of the game. In doing so, however, he has himself become a player in the game, thus making it possible for the game to go on, for it to exist in the first place. If ideology was originally a bridge between the system and an individual as an individual, then the moment he steps onto this bridge, it becomes at the same time a bridge between the system and the individual as a component of the system. That is, if ideology originally facilitated by acting outwardly, the constitution of power by serving as a psychological excuse, then from the moment that excuse is accepted, it constitutes power inwardly, becoming an active component in that power. It begins to function as the principal instrument of ritual communication within the system of power. The whole power structure, and we have already discussed its physical articulation, could not exist at all if there were not a certain metaphysical order binding all of its components together, interconnecting them and subordinating them to a uniform method of accountability, supplying the combined operation of all of these components with rules of the game. That is, with certain regulations, limitations, and legalities. I'm going to chime in here. We also hear party-nost or party spirit here, don't we? We do. This metaphysical order is fundamental to and standard throughout the entire power structure. It integrates its communication system. It makes possible the internal exchange and transfer of information and instructions. It is rather like a collection of traffic signs, directional signals, giving the process shape and structure. This metaphysical order guarantees the inner cohesion of the totalitarian power structure. It is the glue holding it together, its binding principle, the instrument of its discipline. Without this glue, the structure, as a totalitarian structure, would vanish. It would disintegrate into individual atoms, chaotically colliding with one another in their unregulated particular interests and inclinations. The entire pyramid of totalitarian power, deprived of the element that binds it together, would collapse. In itself, as it were, in a kind of material implosion. As the interpretation of reality by the power structure, ideology is always subordinated ultimately to the interests of the structure. Therefore, it has a natural tendency to disengage itself from reality, to create a world of appearances, to become ritual. In societies where there is public competition for power, and therefore public control of that power, there also exists quite naturally a public control of the way that power legitimizes itself, ideologically. Consequently, in such conditions, there are always certain correctives that effectively prevent ideology from abandoning reality altogether. Under totalitarianism, however, these correctives disappear, and thus there is nothing to prevent ideology from becoming more and more removed from reality, gradually turning into what it has already become in the post-totalitarian system, a world of appearances, a mere ritual, a formalized language deprived of semantic contact with reality and transformed into a system of ritual signs that replace reality with pseudo-reality. Yet, as we have seen, ideology becomes at the same time an increasingly important component of power, a pillar providing with both excusatory legitimacy and an inner coherence. As this aspect grows in importance, and as it gradually loses touch with reality, it acquires a peculiar but very real strength. It becomes reality itself, albeit a reality altogether self-contained, one that on certain levels, chiefly inside the power structure, may have greater weight than reality as such. Increasingly, the virtuosity of the ritual becomes more important than the reality behind it, hidden behind it. The significance of phenomena no longer derives from the phenomena themselves, but from their locus as concepts in the ideological context. Reality does not shape theory, but rather the reverse. Thus, power gradually draws closer to ideology than it does to reality. It draws strength from theory and becomes entirely dependent on it. This inevitably leads, of course, to a paradoxical result. Rather than theory, or rather ideology serving power, power begins to serve ideology. It is as though ideology had appropriated power from power, as though it had become dictator itself. Then appears that theory itself, ritual itself, ideology itself makes decisions that affect people, and not the other way around. If ideology is the principal guarantee of the inner consistency of power, it becomes at the same time an increasingly important guarantee of its continuity. Whereas succession in power in a classical dictatorships is always a rather complicated affair. The pretenders have nothing to give their claims reasonable legitimacy, thereby forcing them always to resort to confrontations of naked power. In the post-totalitarian system, power is passed on from person to person, click to click, and from generation to generation in an essentially more regular fashion. In the selection of pretenders, a new kingmaker takes part. It is ritual legitimation, the ability to rely on ritual, to fulfill it and use it, to allow oneself, as it were, to be borne aloft by it. Naturally, power struggles exist in the post-totalitarian system as well, and most of them are far more brutal than in an open society. For the struggle is not open, regulated by democratic rules, and subject to public control, but hidden behind the scenes. It is difficult to recall a single instance in which the first secretary of our ruling Communist Party has been replaced without the various military and security forces being placed at least on alert. This struggle, however, can never, as it can in a classical dictatorship, threaten the very essence of the system and its continuity. At most, it will shake up the power structure, which will recover quickly, precisely because the binding substance ideology remains undisturbed, no matter who is replaced by whom. Succession is only possible against the backdrop and within the framework of a common ritual. It can never take place by denying that ritual, because of the dictatorship of the ritual. However, power becomes clearly anonymous. Individuals are almost dissolved into the ritual. They allow themselves to be swept along by it, and frequently it seems as though ritual alone carries people from obscurity into the light of power. Is it not characteristic of the post-totalitarian system that on all levels of the power hierarchy, individuals are increasingly being pushed aside by faceless people, puppets, those uniform flunkies of the ritual and routines of power? The automatic operation of a power structure, thus dehumanized and made anonymous, is a feature of the fundamental automatism of this system, and it would seem that it is precisely the diktats of this automatism which select people lacking individual will for the power structure. That it is precisely the diktat of the empty phrase which summons to power people who use empty phrases as the best guarantee that the automatism of the post-totalitarian system will continue. Western Sovietologists often exaggerate the role of individuals in the post-totalitarian system and overlook the fact that the ruling figures, despite the immense power they possess through the centralized structure of power, are often no more than blind executors of the system's own internal laws. Laws they themselves can never, and never do, reflect upon. In any case, experience has taught us again and again that this automatism is far more powerful than the will of any individual. And should someone possess a more independent will, he must conceal it behind a ritually anonymous mask in order to have the opportunity to enter the power hierarchy at all. And when the individual finally gains a place there and tries to make his will felt within it, that automatism, with its enormous inertia, will triumph sooner or later, and either the individual will be ejected from the power structure like a foreign organism, or he will be compelled to resign his individuality gradually, once again blending with the automatism and becoming its servant, almost indistinguishable from those who preceded him and those who will follow. Let us recall, for instance, the development of Husek or Gamuka, the necessity of continually hiding behind and relating to ritual means that even the more enlightened members of power, of the power structure, are obsessed with ideology. They are never able to plunge straight to the bottom of naked reality, and they always confuse it in the final analysis with ideological pseudo-reality. In my opinion, one of the reasons the Dubek leadership lost control of the situation in 1968 was precisely because, in extreme situations and in final questions, its members were never capable of extricating themselves completely from the world of appearances. It can be said, therefore, that ideology as the instrument of internal communication which assures the power structure of inner coherence is in the post-totalitarian system something that transcends the physical aspects of power, something that dominates it to a considerable degree, therefore tends to assure its continuity as well. It is one of the pillars of the system's external stability. This pillar, however, is built on a very unstable foundation. It is built on lies. It works only as long as people are willing to live within the lie. End of section 5. I will take a break for a moment, and I think I'll continue here with section 6 shortly. Any feedback anybody has, I'll read it. I'll be back with you in a little bit. Thanks.